The Shattered Crown of Ethermore, Chapter 1. The Last Ember. The crystal spires of Lumenhold stretched skyward like the fingers of some primordial giant, each one a masterwork of living stone that had grown from the bedrock over centuries of careful cultivation. 37 towers in total, they formed 3 concentric circles around the city's heart, their surfaces carved with runes that shifted and changed with the phases of the 3 moons. By day, they gleamed like captured starlight. By night, they pulsed with a pale blue radiance that had once been bright enough to read by from leagues away. Now, as Kira pressed her palm against the nearest tower's base, she could feel the ancient magic thrumming beneath her fingertips, weak and irregular, like the heartbeat of a dying patient. The crystal felt warm to the touch, almost feverish, and hairline cracks spiderwebbed across its surface where the strain of maintaining the barriers had grown too great. Kira Ashworth had been born with ember-blessed blood, a gift that manifested as golden flecks in her dark brown eyes, and the ability to see magical auras as clearly as others saw color. At 23, she was tall and lean from years of climbing the crystal spires, with calloused hands that bore the scars of working with raw, magical energy. Her auburn hair was kept in a practical braid, and she wore the deep blue robes of an Ember Keeper, though the silver threading that marked her rank as the city's primary keeper seemed to weigh heavier with each passing day. "The barriers won't hold much longer," she whispered to the evening wind, her breath visible in the cooling air. Around her, the city of Lumenhold spread out in terraced levels, each district built into the natural contours of the mountainside. The architecture was a blend of grown crystal and carved stone, with buildings that seemed to flow organically from one to another, connected by bridges of woven light that dimmed and brightened with the traffic of citizens moving about their evening business. From her vantage point on the middle reach, the tier of the city reserved for the Ember Keepers and their workshops, she could see all the way down to the merchants' quarter in the lower city, where lanterns made from crystallized fireflies cast dancing shadows on the cobblestone streets. Above her, the high sanctum rose like a crystal crown atop the mountain, its walls transparent enough that she could see the Council of Keepers moving about their evening deliberations like ghosts in a glass house. But it was beyond the city walls that drew her worried gaze. The Shadowlands crept closer each day, a tide of absolute darkness that consumed everything it touched. Where the shadow met the light cast by Lumenhold's spires, the very air shimmered with the conflict between creation and void. Flowers that had bloomed for centuries withered and cracked to dust. Ancient oak trees, their bark carved with protective wards, split and toppled as their life force was drained away. Even the stones themselves seemed to lose their substance, becoming gray and brittle before crumbling to ash. The crown of eternal light, the artifact that had protected Ethermore for over 1,000 years, had been shattered 3 moons ago when the Shadow King's forces breached the sacred vault. Kira still remembered that night, the screaming of the warning crystals, the way the protective barriers had flickered like candle flames in a hurricane, and the terrible sound of something infinitely precious breaking beyond any hope of simple repair. As the last Ember Keeper in the realm of Ethermore, the others had fallen defending the vault or fled to distant lands when the crown was lost. Kira carried a burden that felt heavier than the mountains themselves. The fragments of the crown were scattered, its power diminished to a mere echo of what it had once been. Each day she channeled what remained of her ember-blessed energy into the spires, buying them perhaps another dawn, another sunset, another few precious hours for the people she had sworn to protect. A commotion in the streets below caught her attention, and she leaned over the crystal balustrade to get a better view. The merchant's quarter was alive with torchlight and shouting voices, not the jovial noise of evening trade, but the harsh commands of guards and the clatter of armor on cobblestone. A procession was making its way up from the lower gate, following the spiral road that wound around the mountain toward the high sanctum. The guards wore the silver and blue livery of the city watch, their ceremonial armor polished to mirror brightness, but showing the wear of real battles. Captain Marcus Ironhold led the procession, his weathered face grim beneath his plumed helmet. Kira had known Marcus since childhood. He'd been a friend of her father's before the fever took both her parents when she was 16. He was a good man, honest and brave, but she could see the strain in his posture, the way his hand rested perpetually on his sword hilt these days. Between the guards walked a prisoner, and something about the figure made Kira's ember-blessed vision sharpen with interest. The prisoner moved with fluid grace despite the heavy shackles that bound both wrists and ankles, chains forged with power-dampening runes that glowed a dull red in her enhanced sight. Beneath a tattered hood, she glimpsed skin that seemed to shimmer and shift, and when the prisoner turned slightly, catching the light of a street lamp, Kira saw scales that reflected the crystal spire's glow like fragments of captured sky. A dragon seer. Her heart began to race with possibilities she hardly dared consider. The dragon seers had vanished from Ethermore over a century ago, taking with them the ancient knowledge of crown forging and the secrets of binding disparate magics into unified purpose. They had been tall, proud beings, not quite human, not quite dragon, but something that bridged both natures. The old texts spoke of their wisdom and their terrible pride, their ability to speak with the voices of storms and their mastery over the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself. If one had returned to Lumenhold, even as a prisoner, it could only mean that the situation was even more desperate than Kira had realized. Or perhaps, if she dared to hope, it meant that salvation might still be possible. She leaped from the crystal balustrade to the roof of a nearby building, her ember-blessed blood allowing her to land with cat-like grace on the slate tiles. From there, she bounded from rooftop to rooftop, following the procession as it wound its way through the middle reach and toward the fortress-like structure of the city's dungeon. The detention spire, as it was formerly known, was a squat, ugly building that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, the only structure in Lumenhold built entirely of mundane stone, specifically designed to contain beings whose magical abilities might prove troublesome. As the guards disappeared through the spire's iron-bound doors, Kira made a decision that would either save her world or doom it entirely. She had to speak with the Dragon Seer, had to learn what knowledge they possessed about the crown's restoration. The barriers were failing. The Shadow King's forces grew stronger each day, and Lumenhold's people looked to her for protection. She was no longer certain she could provide. If there was even the slightest chance that this mysterious prisoner could help her restore the crown of eternal light, she had to take it, regardless of the consequences. Chapter 2, The Dragon's Bargain. The dungeons beneath the detention spire delved deep into Lumenhold's mountain heart, following natural cave systems that had been enlarged and reinforced over centuries of use. The air grew thick and stagnant as Kira descended, carrying the weight of stone and years and forgotten sorrows. Moisture seeped through the walls, despite the best efforts of the builders, creating patches of sickly phosphorescent moss that provided the only natural light in the deepest levels. She had entered through a maintenance shaft that connected to the old aqueduct system, a route she'd discovered as a curious child and never forgotten. Her ember-blessed blood allowed her to navigate the absolute darkness without stumbling, seeing the magical resonances that clung to the walls like ghostly fingerprints. Here, a cell where a fire mage had been held decades ago, the stones still warm to the touch. There, scratches in the rock where something with claws had tried desperately to dig its way to freedom. The dungeon followed a brutal but efficient design, a central hub with corridors radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel, each level deeper than the last. The common criminals and debtors were held on the upper levels, in cells with barred windows that at least allowed them to see the sky. Political prisoners and those deemed dangerous to the realm were kept in the middle levels, where the walls were lined with power-dampening crystals. But the deepest level, the Vault of Sorrows, as the guards called it, was reserved for those whose very existence was considered a threat to the city's stability. It was there that Kira found the Dragon Seer, in the deepest chamber of the deepest level, sitting cross-legged in the center of a cell, designed to hold beings far larger and more dangerous than any human. The Dragon Seer was magnificent, even in captivity. She appeared to be a woman in her 30s by human standards, though Kira knew that Dragon Seers aged differently than mortals and could be centuries old while maintaining their apparent youth. Her skin was pale as moonlight, marked with intricate patterns of scales that shifted from deep blue to silver to gold depending on how the light caught them. These weren't decorative tattoos or painted designs. They were part of her very flesh, creating swirling mandalas along her arms and neck that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Her hair was long and straight, so purely white it seemed to glow against the darkness of the cell, and her eyes held the golden depth of ancient dragon fire, not the warm gold of sunrise, but the fierce, molten gold of metal, fresh from the forge. She wore simple prisoner's clothing, rough woven cloth that seemed almost insulting against her otherworldly beauty, but she sat with perfect composure despite the chains that bound her wrists and ankles. The chains themselves were masterworks of the jailer's art, each link inscribed with runes designed to suppress magical abilities, forged from meteoric iron and tempered in water blessed by the previous generation of Ember Keepers. They hummed with contained power, creating a field of magical nullification around the prisoner that would make even the simplest cantrip impossible to cast. "You're not here by accident," the Dragon Seer said without looking up, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Kira's bones. It was a beautiful voice, musical and layered, but there was steel beneath the melody. "The ember in your blood calls to me like a beacon in this place of muffled magic. I could sense you the moment you entered the dungeon." Kira stepped closer to the bars, noting how the cell had been carved from a single piece of black granite, polished smooth and inscribed with containment words, "The crown of eternal light," she said, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "You know how to restore it, don't you?" The Dragon Seer finally raised her head, and Kira felt the weight of that golden gaze like a physical presence. The woman's face was sharp-featured and aristocratic, with high cheekbones and a jaw that spoke of stubborn pride. But there was sadness there too, deep and old, the kind of sorrow that came from outliving everything you had ever loved. "I am Lysara, last daughter of the draconic court of the Eastern Reaches, keeper of the flame eternal, singer of the deep harmonies," she said, and each title carried weight and history that made the air itself seem heavier. "And yes, I know the art of crown forging. It was my ancestor Paraxis the Golden who helped create the original crown of eternal light, binding his own life force into the artifact to give it the power to hold back the forces of entropy itself." She stood gracefully despite her chains, and Kira saw that she was tall, nearly 6 feet, with the kind of fluid movement that suggested perfect control over every muscle and sinew. But the price for such knowledge, even if you could free me from these enchanted chains, what I would ask in return might be more than your dying world could bear. "Tell me," Kira said, her hands gripping the cold iron bars. Around them, the dungeon seemed to hold its breath, as if the very stones were listening. Lysara moved to the center of her cell, her chains clinking softly with each step. The sound echoed strangely in the confined space, creating harmonics that almost sounded like distant music. To reforge the crown of eternal light requires 3 components, each more difficult to obtain than the last. She held up one scaled finger. First, the breath of the first dragon, sealed away in the floating isles of Stormhaven when the great Paraxis Primordial sacrificed herself to create the barriers between realms. It rests in a temple guarded by her corrupted offspring, storm dragons whose minds were twisted by their mother's death, agony. A second finger joined the first. Second, a tear of the moon goddess Selene, hidden somewhere in the whispering desert where reality grows thin, and the boundaries between dream and waking become meaningless. The desert itself will test any who seek the tear, showing them visions of their deepest fears and most desperate desires. The third finger rose, and Lysara's voice became heavy with sorrow. And third, the willing sacrifice of an Ember Keeper's life force, freely given to bind the other components together. Not death, that would be too simple, but the permanent surrender of the very essence that makes you what you are. The words hit Kira like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain steady. "If it saves Ethermore?" "Think carefully, young keeper." Lysara's eyes burned with intensity. "There are other Ember Keepers in distant lands, but you are the last one here, the final guardian of Lumenhold. Without you, Even a restored crown would have no one to wield it. The artifact is not simply a thing of power, it requires a living will to direct it, someone whose very nature resonates with its purpose. Kira gripped the bars tighter, feeling the cold iron against her palms. Around them, the dungeon's silence was broken only by the distant dripping of water and the faint whisper of air moving through stone corridors. Then we'll have to find another way. But first, I need to get you out of here. Lysera tilted her head, studying Kira with those unsettling golden eyes. And why would you risk so much for someone you've never met? I could be lying about the crown. I could be a spy for the Shadow King himself, sent here to lure the last Ember Keeper into a trap. Because, Kira said simply, you're the only hope we have left. The barriers fail a little more each day. People are starting to evacuate the lower city, and soon the shadow will reach the middle reach. If there's even the smallest chance you're telling the truth, I have to take it. A slow smile spread across Lysara's face, transforming her aristocratic features into something almost warm. Spoken like a true guardian. Very well, young Ember Keeper. If you can free me from these chains and this cage, I will help you gather the components needed to restore the crown. But understand this, the path we must walk will be dangerous beyond imagining, and there is no guarantee we will survive to see its end. I understand, Kira said, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. But I'd rather die trying to save my people than live knowing I could have acted and chose not to. Lysera nodded approvingly. Then let us begin with the most immediate problem. These chains. They are key to the dungeon's main power crystal, drawing their suppressive energy from the same source that lights this place. If you could overload the crystal for just a moment. I'll plunge half the city into darkness, Kira realized, already seeing the implications. The backup crystals will engage eventually, but there will be chaos, panic. Only for a few minutes, Lysera assured her. And the alternative is watching your world slowly consumed by shadow, while we remain trapped down here debating philosophy. Kira closed her eyes, feeling for the dungeon's power crystal through her ember-blessed senses. It was 3 levels above them, a massive construct of crystallized light that powered not just the prison but several blocks of the middle reach. To overload, it would require every scrap of her remaining strength, and there was no guarantee she'd have enough energy left to help Lysara escape afterward. But as she reached out to touch the crystal's resonance, she felt something unexpected, an echo of power that wasn't her own, flowing from the dragon seer despite the suppressive chains. Lysera was somehow lending her strength, their magical essences intertwining in a way that should have been impossible. How are you doing that? Kira whispered. Dragon magic operates on different principles than human sorcery, Lysera replied, her voice taking on those strange harmonics again. Your chains cannot completely contain what I am, only muffle it. And our purposes are aligned. The binding between us grows stronger with shared intent. Together they reach for the crystal, and Kira felt power flowing through her that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was wild and ancient and utterly confident, the magical heritage of beings who had shaped the very foundations of reality. Under Lysara's guidance, she pushed that power into the dungeon's crystal matrix, forcing it to burn brighter and brighter until... crack. The sound echoed through the dungeon like thunder, and every light in the lower city died at once. In the sudden darkness, Kira heard the musical chime of breaking chains and felt a surge of heat as Lysera's draconic heritage flared to life, no longer constrained by the suppressive magic. This way, Kira gasped, her legs shaking from the magical effort. I know a path through the old aqueducts. As they ran through pitch-black corridors guided only by Kira's ember sight and the faint glow emanating from Lysara's scales, the dragon seer spoke urgently over the sound of their footsteps. There is something else you must know about the crown's restoration, something I did not mention while we were being observed. Observed? Kira asked, helping Lysera navigate a particularly treacherous stretch where the corridor had partially collapsed. The Shadow King's agents have ways of listening even through stone and spell. But here, in the chaos of our escape, we may speak more freely. Lysera's voice carried a new urgency. The Shadow King didn't just steal the fragments of the crown of eternal light randomly. He knew exactly what he was doing. He's trying to forge a crown of his own, one that will let him control the Shadowlands instead of merely commanding them. They emerged into the night air through a concealed grate, the stars overhead feeling like old friends after the oppressive atmosphere of the dungeon. Around them, Lumenhold was in controlled chaos as the backup crystals slowly came online, casting the city in an uncertain, flickering light. "How long do we have?" Kira asked, helping Lysara to her feet on the unfamiliar ground. 3 days, perhaps 4. Once he completes his dark crown, not even a restored crown of eternal light will be able to stop him. The two artifacts will be locked in eternal conflict, and that struggle will tear apart not just Ethermore, but every realm connected to it. Lysara's golden eyes reflected the starlight, and for a moment, she looked less like a prisoner and more like the ancient, powerful being she truly was. "We need help, Kira. More help than just the two of us can provide. The trials we must face were designed to test entire expeditions, not lone heroes." "I know someone," Kira said, thinking of the messages that had been arriving through the Crystal Network, reports from other realms of heroes and magic workers who might be willing to aid them. "But first, we need to reach the floating Isles of Stormhaven, and for that, we're going to need a ship that can sail through sky instead of sea." Lysara smiled, and for the first time, Kira saw a hint of the pride and power that had once made the Dragon Seers the masters of their domain. "Leave that to me, young Emberkeeper. It's time the dragons of Ethermore remembered how to fly." As they made their way through the darkened streets of Lumenhold, neither of them noticed the shadowy figure that watched from a nearby rooftop, a being whose very presence seemed to drain light from the air around it, and whose eyes burned with the cold fire of the void itself. The hunt had begun. Chapter 3. The Heist of Shadows. The crystal spires of Lumenhold had barely finished restoring their light when Captain Thorn Stormright received the most unusual commission of his career. The message had arrived through channels he'd thought were known only to smugglers and sky pirates, a request for immediate transport to the floating isles. Payment guaranteed. Passenger manifest classified. Thorn stood 6 feet tall with the kind of weathered build that came from years of working airship rigging in storms that could turn a man inside out. His hair had gone prematurely gray from repeated exposure to lightning magic, and his left arm had been replaced with an intricate mechanical construct after a particularly explosive encounter with a wind elemental. The prosthetic was a masterwork of brass and steel, inscribed with storm runes that crackled with contained electricity and gave him the ability to conduct lightning through his fingertips. His ship, the Windraiser, was moored at the sky docks that jutted out from Lumenhold's eastern face like a crystalline shelf. The vessel was a hybrid design, part sailing ship, part magical construct, with a hull of storm-touched oak reinforced with bands of sky iron. Her masts were grown from living crystal that could bend with the wind without breaking, and her sails were woven from threads of crystallized air that could catch magical currents invisible to mundane fabrics. "Never thought I'd be harboring fugitives from Lumenhold," he called over the wind to Kira and Lysara as they approached through the pre-dawn darkness. The city's crystal spires were just beginning to catch the first light of the rising sun, casting long shadows across the docks, where other airships bobbed at anchor like tethered birds. Kira had disguised herself in the rough clothing of a dock worker, but her ember-blessed eyes were unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. Lysara had wrapped herself in a hooded cloak that concealed her scaled skin, though nothing could hide her otherworldly grace or the way shadows seemed to bend around her as if she existed slightly outside normal reality. "Especially not," Thorn continued, his mechanical arm whirring as he secured a loose rope, "when one of them has scales that shimmer like starlight, and the other just broke half the city's lighting system." "Can you get us to Stormhaven?" Kira asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Behind them, the city was coming alive with the sounds of the morning watch, guards patrolling the streets, market vendors setting up their stalls, and the ever-present hum of magical energy flowing through the crystal network. "To the floating isles?" Thorn's weathered face creased with consideration. "It's possible, but it won't be easy. The storm barriers around Stormhaven aren't just weather. They're defensive magic left over from the Dragon Wars. Most ships that try to penetrate them end up as driftwood in 3 dimensions simultaneously. We can pay, Kira said, though she wasn't entirely sure how. The Ember Keeper's treasury contained a modest stipend for official business, but nothing like the fortune such a dangerous journey would normally command. Keep your coin, Ember Keeper. Thorn's mechanical arms sparked as he made an adjustment to the ship's crystal matrix. The Shadowlands took my wife 3 years ago. During the first major incursion, she was leading a merchant caravan through the Thornwood Pass when the shadow swept over them. Found nothing but her wedding ring and a pile of gray ash where her body should have been. His voice carried old pain, carefully controlled, but never truly healed. If you can push back those cursed shadows, if you can give me a chance to make the bastards pay for what they took from me, then consider this passage a down payment on revenge. The Windraiser cast off just as the sun crested the peaks of the Dragonspine Mountains, lifting away from the dock with the smooth acceleration that marked a well-maintained magical vessel. As they rose above Lumenhold's crystal spires, Kira could see the full extent of her city spread out below, a jewel of civilization carved into the living rock of the mountain, its terraced levels connected by bridges of light and crystal. But she could also see the advancing edge of the Shadowlands, closer now than it had been even yesterday. The line between light and shadow was sharp as a blade, and where the darkness touched the outer settlements, nothing remained but empty husks of buildings and lifeless gray soil. It's moving faster, she said to Lysera, who stood beside her at the ship's rail. The Dragon Seer had thrown back her hood now that they were airborne, revealing the full extent of her scaled markings and the way her white hair seemed to catch and hold the morning light. The Shadow King grows stronger as his dark crown nears completion, Lysera replied, her golden eyes fixed on the advancing darkness. Each realm he consumes feeds power back into the artifact, accelerating the corruption. We may have even less time than I feared. The floating isles of Stormhaven appeared on the horizon as twisted shapes wreathed in perpetual storm clouds. They were exactly what their name suggested. Massive chunks of rock and earth suspended in midair by ancient magic, connected by bridges of crystallized lightning and paths of solidified wind. Each isle harbored its own ecosystem, its own unique dangers, and according to legend, its own fragment of the power that had once belonged to the first dragon. There, Lysera pointed to the largest isle, where a temple of black stone crowned a peak, wreathed in storm clouds so thick they seemed almost solid. Lightning danced between the clouds in patterns too regular to be natural, and the air itself hummed with barely contained power. The Temple of the Final Breath. That's where Paraxis Primordial sealed away the last of her essence before she died. Cheerful name, Thorn observed, his mechanical arm already beginning to glow with gathered lightning as he prepared for the approach. And what exactly are we going to find guarding this temple? Storm dragons, Lysera replied matter-of-factly, the corrupted offspring of the first dragon, born from the magical backlash of her death. They've had over 1,000 years to grow in power and madness, feeding on the chaotic energy of the perpetual storms. As if summoned by her words, shapes began moving in the storm clouds, serpentine forms with wings like torn banners and eyes that glowed with spectral fire. They were beautiful and terrible, their scales flickering between solid matter and pure energy, their voices carrying harmonics that could shatter stone or drive mortals mad with their alien music. Well, Captain Thorn said, his weathered face breaking into a grin that held no humor whatsoever. This should be interesting. Hold tight, ladies. We're about to find out if the Windraiser can dance with dragons. The first storm dragon dove toward them with a shriek that seemed to tear holes in the air itself. It was massive, easily twice the length of the airship, with wings that crackled with contained lightning and claws that left trails of ionized air in their wake. When it opened its maw, the breath that emerged wasn't fire, but pure electrical fury, a bolt of lightning wide as a man and hot as the heart of a star. Kira raised her hands instinctively, her ember-blessed power flaring to life in a net of crystallized light. The dragon's lightning strike hit her barrier and scattered into 1,000 smaller bolts that danced harmlessly around the ship's hull before being absorbed by the storm-touched wood. Impressive, Thorn called. spinning the ship's wheel to avoid the claws of a second dragon that had appeared from behind a cloud bank. But we've got more company coming. Indeed, more storm dragons were emerging from the perpetual tempest, dozens of them, circling the airship like vultures around Carrion. Their collective presence made the very air thrum with power, and Kira could feel the Windrazer's magical systems straining to maintain stability in the face of such concentrated draconic energy. Lysera! Kira called over the wind and the sound of dragon song. Can you speak to them? You share draconic heritage. Maybe they'll listen to reason. The dragon seer closed her golden eyes and began to sing, her voice carrying the deep harmonics of the ancient draconic tongue. The melody was haunting and complex, full of mathematical relationships that seemed to describe the fundamental structure of reality itself. As she sang, her scales began to glow with inner light, and the storm dragons gradually slowed their circling, their spectral forms flickering with what might have been confusion. Then the largest of them, easily the size of the airship itself, descended toward them with deliberate grace. Its scales were the deep blue-black of storm clouds, shot through with veins of silver lightning, and its eyes held the ancient wisdom of creatures that had witnessed the birth and death of worlds. When it spoke, its voice was like the rumble of distant thunder, carrying across dimensions that human ears were never meant to perceive. Who dares seek the First Mother's breath? Who comes with dragon speech in a human throat? Lysera stepped forward, spreading her arms to display her scaled markings in the ritual gesture of draconic greeting. I am Lysera of the Draconic Court, daughter of Peraxis the Golden, last heir to the Eastern Reaches. I seek the breath not for conquest or personal glory, but for restoration. The crown of eternal light must be reforged, or all our realms, dragon and human alike, will fall to the creeping shadow that devours light itself. The great storm dragon circled them once, twice, its ancient eyes studying every detail of their party, with the intensity of a scholar examining a particularly complex theorem. The other dragons held their positions, waiting for their elder's judgment, their spectral forms shifting between states of matter like living aurora. Finally, the creature landed on the ship's deck with surprising gentleness, folding wings that could have sheltered a small village. Up close, Kira could see that its scales were not simply decorative. Each one was inscribed with microscopic runes that pulsed with their own inner light, creating patterns of meaning too complex for any mortal mind to fully comprehend. The Draconic Court has been silent for 100 years, the dragon rumbled, its voice now carrying undertones of deep sadness. We feared you were all extinct, the last of the bridge builders between our kinds. Nearly so, Lysera admitted, her own voice thick with emotion. I am likely the last, but the old packs still hold, do they not? Dragonkin to dragonkin, in the face of extinction itself? The dragon's laugh was like controlled lightning, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Indeed they do, little cousin, but the temple's trials were not made for the likes of humans and their floating contraptions. The First Mother's breath is guarded not just by our kind, but by the fundamental forces she mastered in life, wind and storm, lightning and the spaces between raindrops. You will have to prove your worth in the old ways, according to the ancient laws. What kind of trials? Kira asked, though from the dragon's expression. Insofar as she could read expressions on a face made of living storm energy, she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. The dragon's smile revealed teeth like crystallized lightning bolts, beautiful and utterly terrifying. The kind that separate heroes from legends, young Emberkeeper. The kind that forge souls like steel in the cosmic furnace, or shatter them entirely into component elements that drift away on the wind. It gestured with one wing toward the temple, barely visible through the swirling storm clouds. 3 trials await you there. The trial of courage, which will test your willingness to act in the face of impossible odds. The trial of wisdom, which will challenge your ability to see truth through layers of deception and misdirection. And the trial of sacrifice, which will demand that you surrender something precious for the greater good. And if we fail? Thorn asked, his mechanical arm crackling with nervous energy. Then your failures will become part of the storm itself. The dragon replied with casual finality. Your courage will strengthen the winds, your wisdom will guide the lightning, and your sacrifice will feed the tempest for all eternity. It is not an ignoble fate. Many great heroes have chosen to become one with the eternal storm rather than face the diminishment of merely mortal death. Kira felt the crown of eternal light pulse within her chest, its fragmentary power responding to the challenge with something that felt almost like eagerness. "We'll take that risk," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "The alternative is watching everything we care about consumed by shadow." The great dragon nodded approvingly. "Spoken like one worthy of the trials. Very well. We will escort you to the Temple of the Final Breath. But be warned, once you enter, we cannot aid you. The trials must be faced with only the strength you carry within yourselves." As the Windraiser approached the storm-wreathed temple, guided by an honor guard of ancient dragons, Kira found herself thinking of the people of Lumenhold, going about their daily lives, trusting in their protectors, unaware of how close they stood to the edge of absolute darkness. Whatever happened in the temple ahead, she would not let them down. Chapter 4: The Trials of Wind and Fire. The Temple of the Final Breath stood at the heart of a perpetual maelstrom, its black stone walls carved with runes that shifted and changed when viewed directly, as if the very act of observation altered their meaning. The structure was massive, easily the size of a small city, but it seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could properly process. Corridors appeared to bend back on themselves, spires twisted through angles that shouldn't have been geometrically possible, and stairways led both up and down simultaneously, while somehow never intersecting. The architecture was pure draconic design, not built by human hands but grown from the living rock by beings who understood the fundamental mathematics of reality. Every surface was covered with intricate carvings that seemed to move in peripheral vision, depicting the history of dragonkind from their first emergence from the cosmic egg to their eventual transcendence into pure elemental force. The main entrance was a massive archway shaped like an open dragon's maw, with teeth of crystallized lightning and eyes of captured starfire that tracked their movement as they approached. Captain Thorn guided the Windraiser to a landing platform that materialized from solid storm cloud as they drew near, the magical construct recognizing their intent and providing safe harbor. The platform was inscribed with warning runes in 17 different languages, all variations on the same basic message. "Enter at your own risk. The trials within will change you or destroy you. There is no middle path." "Comforting," Thorn muttered, securing the ship's moorings to posts that appeared to be made of crystallized wind. His mechanical arm sparked nervously as the temple's ambient magical field interfered with its delicate mechanisms. "How long should I wait before assuming you're not coming back?" "Give us 3 days," Kira said, though she had no idea whether that would be enough time. The trials could last minutes or centuries. Time flowed differently in places of high magical concentration, and the temple practically hummed with power that made her ember-blessed senses ache. "And if the Shadow King's forces find the ship while you're inside?" Lysara asked, her golden eyes scanning the storm clouds for signs of pursuit. "Then I'll give them a demonstration of why sky pirates learn to fight dirty," Thorn replied grimly, patting the lightning cannon mounted on the ship's foredeck. "Just don't take too long. I've got a feeling we're going to have company sooner rather than later." The temple's entrance hall was vast enough to house a dozen airships, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shifting mists high above. The walls were lined with alcoves containing statues of long-dead dragon lords, each one a masterwork of impossible artistry that seemed to capture not just physical form, but the essence of the beings they represented. Their eyes followed the intruders with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely contained hostility. At the hall's center stood a pedestal of living crystal, and hovering above it, 3 paths made of solidified light led deeper into the temple. Each path was marked with symbols that pulsed with inner fire: a sword for courage, an eye for wisdom, and a scale for sacrifice. "The trials must be undertaken in order," Lysara explained, her voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "But they can be faced individually or together, though the temple will adjust its challenges based on how many attempt each trial." "Together," Kira said without hesitation. We've come this far as a group. We finish it that way. The trial of courage manifested as a bridge of pure wind that spanned a chasm filled with screaming void. The bridge was invisible except when lightning flickered through the storm clouds below, revealing its gossamer structure for brief moments before plunging them back into uncertainty. One by one, they had to cross while the bridge itself tried to tear them apart with gale-force winds and spectral claws that emerged from nothingness to rake at their flesh and souls. Captain Thorne went first, his mechanical arm anchoring him against the worst of the winds while he hauled himself forward step by agonizing step. The prosthetic sparked and smoked as it channeled lightning strikes away from his body, but his weathered face remained set in lines of grim determination. He had faced storms before, natural and supernatural, and he understood that the key to surviving them was to never stop moving forward, no matter how badly the wind wanted to throw you back. Kira followed, using her ember-blessed light to ward off the spectral attacks, while the crown's fragmentary power provided some protection against the worst of the supernatural winds. Each step forward felt like walking through quicksand, and the void below seemed to call to her with voices that sounded disturbingly like her dead parents. But she pushed on, driven by the memory of Lumenhold's crystal spires and the knowledge that thousands of people depended on her success. Lysara crossed last, and as she did, something remarkable happened. The winds began to sing in harmony with her dragon song, and the spectral claws became gentle touches that guided rather than hindered her passage. Her draconic heritage recognized the ancient magic woven into the trial, and the bridge acknowledged her kinship with its creators. "The first trial accepts your courage," a voice rumbled from the temple walls themselves, not the great storm dragon from outside, but something older and more fundamental. "But courage without wisdom is mere recklessness. Prove that you understand the difference." The trial of wisdom took place in a chamber filled with mirrors that showed not reflections, but possibilities. Thousands of potential futures branching out like the tributaries of an infinite river. Some mirrors showed worlds where they succeeded in their quest, where the crown of eternal light blazed with renewed power, and the Shadowlands retreated into the void they had come from. Others showed darker possibilities. Kira corrupted by the crown's power, becoming a tyrant worse than the Shadow King. Lysara consumed by her draconic nature, transforming into a storm dragon herself. Captain Thorne lost in the spaces between realities, forever sailing through storms that existed only in nightmares. But the most insidious mirrors were those that showed simpler, more appealing futures. Kira saw herself living peacefully in a world where the Shadowlands had never existed, where she was just another citizen of Lumenhold with no greater burden than deciding what flowers to plant in her garden. The vision was so appealing, so seductive in its promise of normalcy, that she nearly stepped toward that mirror before Lysara's scaled hand on her shoulder reminded her of reality. "The hardest wisdom to accept," the dragon seer whispered, her own gaze fixed on a mirror that showed her reunited with others of her kind, "is that some burdens are worth bearing even when we could choose to set them down." Together, they turned away from the easy paths and faced the mirror that showed them standing atop a mountain of crystal and shadow, holding aloft a crown that burned with the light of every star in the sky. It was a future written in sacrifice and loss, painted in shades of duty and determination, but it was also one where Ethermore survived, and the people they had sworn to protect continued to live and love and dream. The mirror's surface rippled as they approached, and they stepped through into a reality where their choice had weight and consequence. "Wisdom accepted," the temple's voice rumbled with approval. "But wisdom and courage mean nothing without the willingness to sacrifice for others. Face now the hardest trial, the one that will cost you something precious and irreplaceable." The final trial awaited in the temple's heart, a chamber where the first dragon's last breath swirled in an eternal vortex of golden fire and starlight. The breath was beautiful beyond description, a miniature galaxy of pure draconic power that contained within its swirling depths the compressed essence of creation itself. To claim it, one of them would have to enter the vortex and endure the full weight of draconic transformation, allowing it to either remake them in the image of ancient dragonkind or destroy them utterly in the attempt. "It has to be me," Lysara said, stepping toward the swirling energy. Her scales were already beginning to glow in response to the proximity of so much draconic power. I'm the only one who might survive the transformation intact. But Kira caught her arm, feeling the scales warm beneath her palm. Number, think about what we need. The crown requires a dragon seer to forge it, but it needs an ember keeper to wield it. If you're transformed by the breath, you might lose the knowledge and skill needed to complete the forging process. And if you enter that vortex, there might be nothing left of you to use the crown once it's forged, Lysera countered, her golden eyes reflecting the swirling power. The breath of the first dragon isn't meant for human physiology. It could burn away everything that makes you who you are. Captain Thorne cleared his throat, interrupting their debate with the practiced timing of someone who had settled many disputes in tavern brawls. Pardon the interruption, but has anyone considered that maybe we're thinking about this wrong? They turned to him surprised. The grizzled sky pirate was studying the vortex with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent his life navigating impossible winds, his mechanical arm humming as it analyzed the energy patterns swirling before them. "See how the power flows?" he said, pointing with his prosthetic hand. The lightning-touched metal seemed to resonate with the draconic energy, creating small arcs of electricity that danced between his fingers. It's not trying to destroy, it's trying to choose. The first dragon's breath doesn't want to be claimed by force or cunning. It wants to be inherited by someone who understands what it means to sacrifice everything for the sake of others. He walked to the edge of the vortex, his storm-touched hair standing on end in the presence of so much concentrated power. "I can't forge crowns or wield emberlight. I'm just a sky pirate who's gotten lucky more times than he deserves. But I can fly through any storm that's ever been born, and I've been touched by lightning so many times that it's more familiar to me than sunlight." Before either of them could stop him, Captain Thorne stepped into the vortex with the same casual confidence he'd shown when sailing into his first magical tempest. The golden fire engulfed him, and for a terrifying moment, Kira thought they had lost him. The vortex raged higher, its swirling energies becoming chaotic and unstable as they tried to process the presence of someone whose very nature was antithetical to draconic power. Lightning crackled through the chamber, and the temperature rose until the air itself began to shimmer with heat. Then, gradually, the chaos began to settle. The vortex slowed its frantic spinning, and the golden fire began to take on new patterns. Not the pure draconic geometries it had displayed before, but something hybrid, a fusion of dragon power and storm-touched human will that had never existed in the world before. When the energies finally cleared, Captain Thorne stood unchanged except for his eyes. They now held depths of molten gold that matched Lysera's own, and when he moved, small arcs of golden lightning danced around his mechanical arm. In his hands, contained within a sphere of crystallized wind and bound with chains of living light, swirled the first dragon's breath, no longer wild and untamed, but somehow domesticated by its contact with purely human courage and sacrifice. "Well," he said with a grin that was only slightly shaky, "that was more invigorating than my first lightning strike, though I have a feeling I'm going to be seeing the world differently from now on." Indeed, as they left the temple with their hard-won prize, Kira noticed that Thorne's mechanical arm now sparked with golden light instead of plain electricity, and his understanding of wind and weather patterns seemed to have expanded into realms that mortal sailors never dreamed of exploring. The first dragon's breath pulsed gently in its crystalline container, patient and powerful, waiting to be woven into the crown that would either save their world or destroy it in the attempt. Behind them, the storm dragons sang a farewell that sounded almost like approval, their ancient voices carrying across dimensions to herald the return of the bridge builders between mortal and draconic realms. One component secured, two more to find, and the Shadow King's power growing stronger with each passing hour. The real quest was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Whispering Desert. The journey from Stormhaven to the Whispering Desert took them across the Shattered Lands, a region where reality had been broken and poorly repaired during the ancient dragon wars. Here the sky fractured into geometric patterns of impossible color, and the ground existed in multiple states of matter simultaneously. Rivers flowed uphill through forests of crystallized time, while mountains phased in and out of existence according to the whims of half-forgotten magical experiments. The Windraiser navigated this chaos with supernatural grace, her storm-touched hull adapting to each new impossibility they encountered. Captain Thorne's transformation had given him an intuitive understanding of magical weather patterns, and he guided them through reality storms and temporal hurricanes with the confidence of someone reading a familiar map. There, Lysera pointed to a shimmer on the southern horizon where the shattered lands gave way to something even stranger. The Whispering Desert, where the boundaries between dream and waking become negotiable. The desert stretched out before them like a sea of silver sand that reflected not light, but thoughts themselves. Dunes rose and fell according to the emotional state of those who observed them, and the wind carried voices speaking in languages that existed only in the spaces between sleeping and waking. It was beautiful and terrible, a landscape crafted from the raw stuff of imagination given physical form. The moon goddess Selene's tear is hidden somewhere in that vastness, Lysara continued, her golden eyes troubled as she gazed out over the impossible terrain. But the desert guards its secrets jealously. It will show us our deepest fears and most desperate desires, trying to trap us in walking dreams until we forget what we came seeking. They landed the Windraiser at an oasis that existed at the desert's edge, a place where palm trees grew from crystallized starlight, and a spring of liquid memory bubbled up from the depths of the earth. The water tasted like childhood summers and half-remembered lullabies, but Lysera warned them against drinking too deeply. Memory water is addictive, she explained, as they filled their water skins with more mundane liquid from the ship's stores. A few sips can provide sustenance for days, but too much and you'll lose yourself in nostalgia, living forever in moments that have already passed. The desert welcomed them with whispers that sounded almost like their own voices, calling to them from just beyond the range of normal hearing. The sand beneath their feet was warm and soft, but each step sent ripples spreading outward like waves in a still pond, and in those ripples, images formed and dissolved, fragments of memory and dream that belonged to everyone who had ever crossed this threshold between realities. Their first trial came within hours of entering the desert proper. The landscape around them began to shift and blur, and suddenly they found themselves walking through the streets of Lumenhold, but not as the city existed now. This was Lumenhold as it had been in Kira's childhood, when her parents were still alive and the crystal spires burned with undiminished light. Kira! Her mother's voice called from a doorway that shouldn't have existed, and Kira felt her heart clench with longing so sharp it was almost physical pain. There was Elena Ashworth, exactly as she had been before the fever took her. Dark hair braided with silver thread, eyes the same ember-blessed brown as her daughter's, wearing the green dress she had favored for special occasions. "Come inside, sweetheart," her mother said, extending a hand that seemed solid and real and achingly familiar. "Your father's making that stew you love, and we have so much to talk about. You look tired. Have you been working too hard at your studies?" For a moment, Kira almost stepped toward the offered embrace. The temptation was overwhelming. To set down her burdens, to return to a time when her greatest worry was whether she'd remembered to feed the message crystals in her father's workshop, but then she felt Lysera's scaled hand on her shoulder, anchoring her to the present moment and its responsibilities. "It's not real," the dragon seer said softly, though her own voice carried the weight of similar temptation. Around them, the false Lumenhold was beginning to fracture, revealing glimpses of silver sand beneath the familiar cobblestones. "The desert is showing you what your heart most desires, but accepting it would mean abandoning everything you've sworn to protect." Kira closed her eyes, letting the pain of loss wash over her without trying to escape it. "I know," she whispered. "I know they're gone. But the people who are still alive, they deserve the same chance at happiness my parents wanted for me." When she opened her eyes, the vision of her mother faded like morning mist, leaving behind only the endless expanse of whispering sand and the weight of duty that she carried by choice. Captain Thorne faced his own trial next, a recreation of the day his wife had died, but this time with the power to change the outcome. The caravan appeared around them in perfect detail, the merchant wagons laden with goods from the eastern provinces, the hired guards joking among themselves, and Sarah Stormright, riding beside the lead wagon with her red hair catching the sunlight like captured flame. "Thomas!" she called to him across the years and the space between dream and memory, her voice carrying all the love and laughter that had made her the center of his world. "I've been waiting for you. The shadow hasn't come yet. There's still time to warn everyone. Still time to save them all." The vision showed him the moment of choice. He could call out the warning that would send the caravan racing for safety, could use his knowledge of what was coming to prevent the tragedy that had shaped the last 3 years of his life. All he had to do was abandon his current quest and embrace this second chance the desert offered. But Thorn had learned something about sacrifice in the Temple of the Final Breath, and the golden light now flickering in his eyes showed him the deeper truth hidden within the temptation. This wasn't really his wife. It was his own need for absolution, his desperate desire to undo the choice that had kept him away from her side when she needed him most. "I can't save you, love," he said to the vision, his voice breaking with old grief made fresh. "But I can make sure your death meant something. I can help stop the shadow that took you from spreading to other families, other wives and husbands and children." The false Sarah smiled with infinite sadness and understanding. "I never blamed you for being away, Thomas. I knew what kind of man I married. One who would never stop fighting for what's right, even when it cost him everything." The vision dissolved, leaving Thorn standing alone in the silver sand with tears on his weathered cheeks and a new resolve burning in his storm-touched heart. Lysera's trial was perhaps the most complex, for the desert showed her not one vision, but dozens. An entire alternate history where the draconic court had never fallen, where her people still soared through the skies in great migrations that painted the heavens with rainbow scales. She saw herself as she might have been, not the last of her kind, but one among thousands, with a mate whose scales complemented her own, and children who would carry the ancient bloodlines into a future bright with possibility. "You could have this," the desert whispered in her mind, its voice like wind through crystal chimes. "Step away from this doomed quest. Abandon these short-lived humans to their fate. Use the knowledge you carry to rebuild what was lost, to restore the glory of the Dragonborn to the world." But Lysera had spent too many years in exile, too many decades watching the slow decay of everything her ancestors had built, to be easily swayed by dreams of what might have been. She understood better than her companions the terrible weight of being the last, the crushing responsibility that came with carrying an entire heritage in her memory and bloodline. "The court fell because we grew too proud," she said to the visions swirling around her, her voice carrying harmonics that made the sand itself ring like struck crystal. "We withdrew from the world, convinced that our superiority made us exempt from the struggles of lesser beings. But isolation breeds stagnation, and stagnation leads to death." She spread her arms, letting the scales along her skin catch and reflect the silver light of the desert. "If I am truly the last of my kind, then let me be the last who chose connection over separation, cooperation over domination. Let the legacy of the draconic court end not in bitter isolation but in willing alliance with those we once thought beneath us." The visions faded, and the desert's whispers took on a note of something that might have been respect. Their trials overcome, they found the tear of the moon goddess at the desert's heart, not hidden or guarded, but simply waiting in a grove of silver palm trees that grew around a pool of liquid starlight. The tear itself was a crystal the size of Kara's fist, perfectly clear, but somehow containing within its depths the reflection of every moon that had ever shone on any world in any reality. "The goddess wept only once," Lysera explained, as Kira carefully lifted the crystal from its resting place in the pool. When she saw that consciousness inevitably led to suffering, that awareness always brought with it the capacity for loss and grief. But her tears crystallized into something precious. The understanding that joy is made more valuable by its transience, that love matters precisely because it can be lost. The tear pulsed with gentle warmth in Kira's hands, and for a moment she could feel the vast sadness and infinite compassion of the being who had shaped it. But there was hope there too, the kind of hope that persisted even in the face of inevitable endings, the stubborn refusal to let temporary nature diminish permanent value. Two components now secured, one more to find, and the most dangerous of all. As they prepared to leave the Whispering Desert, none of them noticed the figure watching from a dune in the distance, a being of shadow and hunger, whose very presence began to corrupt the silver sand around its feet, turning it black and lifeless as the void between stars. The Shadow King's greatest servant had found them at last, and the final hunt was about to begin. Chapter 6. The Heart of Darkness. The Shadow King's citadel materialized from nothingness as they approached, a fortress built from crystallized despair and mortared with the dreams of the conquered. It rose from the heart of the Shadowlands like a tumor of absolute darkness, its spires reaching toward a sky that had forgotten what color meant. The very air around it seemed thick with malevolence, and the Windrazer's storm-touched hull groaned under the pressure of so much concentrated evil. "There," Captain Thorne said grimly, his golden eyes reflecting the Citadel's awful majesty. "The bastard's lair. And if I'm reading the magical currents right, he's almost finished with whatever he's building in there." Indeed, they could see dark lightning crackling between the Citadel's towers, and with each pulse, the Shadowlands expanded a little further, consuming another few acres of normal reality and converting them to lifeless gray wasteland. "The Dark Crown," Lysera breathed, her scales dulling in response to the malevolent energy radiating from their destination. "He's nearly completed it. Once he places it on his head, he won't just command the shadows, he'll become shadow itself, able to exist in every dark corner of every realm simultaneously." They had debated their approach during the flight from the Whispering Desert. A direct assault was suicide. The Shadow King's power in his own domain was absolute, and even if they somehow managed to breach the Citadel's defenses, they lacked the final component needed to forge their own crown. But they couldn't simply retreat and hope to find another way. Time was running out, and with each passing hour, more realms fell to the encroaching darkness. The solution, when it came, was both elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. "We let ourselves be captured," Kira had proposed, and the looks on her companions' faces suggested they thought she'd been affected by too much exposure to the desert's reality-warping influence. "Hear me out," she continued, pulling out the fragments of the original Crown of Eternal Light that she carried in a crystal case next to her heart. "The Shadow King has been collecting these pieces for a specific reason, not just to prevent us from restoring the crown, but to corrupt them and incorporate them into his own artifact. If we can get close enough to see his work, close enough to understand how he's binding shadow and light together." "You want to study his crown-forging technique and steal it," Lysara said with something that sounded like admiration. "It's brilliant. It's also the most dangerous thing anyone has ever proposed in my 1,000 years of existence." "The most dangerous part," Captain Thorne added, "will be convincing him that we're really surrendering." The Shadow King didn't conquer half a dozen realms by being gullible. In the end, they had crafted a plan that relied on misdirection and the Shadow King's own arrogance. They would approach openly, appearing to surrender in exchange for the lives of Lumenhold's people. The Shadow King would want to gloat, would want to demonstrate the futility of resistance by showing them his completed crown. And in that moment of triumph, when he was focused on his victory, they would strike, not to destroy the Dark Crown, but to complete their own. The Citadel's gates were wrought from the fossilized screams of the defeated, twisted into Baroque patterns that hurt to look at directly. They opened without any apparent mechanism as the Windrazer approached, revealing a courtyard paved with stones that had once been living beings, transformed by shadow into building materials that retained just enough awareness to suffer eternally. "Cheerful decorating scheme," Thorne muttered, but his mechanical arm was already charging with golden lightning, ready for the fight that was surely coming. They were met by an honor guard of Shadow Knights, beings that had once been human but had been so thoroughly corrupted that only the vaguest outline of their original forms remained. They moved with fluid grace, their armor crafted from crystallized darkness, and their weapons forged from the absence of light itself. "His Majesty has been expecting you," their captain said in a voice like winter wind through dead leaves. "He is most eager to demonstrate the futility of your quest." The throne room was a vast cathedral of malevolence, its vaulted ceiling lost in permanent shadows that seemed to writhe with half-glimpsed shapes. Pillars of black crystal supported the weight of the structure, each one carved with the history of the Shadow King's conquest in detail so fine it would have taken centuries to complete. But it was the throne itself that drew their attention, a massive construction of fused bones and crystallized screams, beautiful in its horrible artistry. And upon that throne sat the Shadow King himself. He had been human once, perhaps 1,000 years ago, but shadow and time had transformed him into something both more and less than mortal. His form was tall and elegant, draped in robes that seemed to be cut from the fabric of night itself, but his face was the most disturbing thing of all, perfectly preserved, handsome even, but with eyes that held the cold depths of the void between stars. "Kira Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the throne room's crystals ring in sympathy. "Last Ember Keeper of Ethermore, Guardian of the Dying Light, I have watched your progress with great interest." He gestured, and images appeared in the air between them, scenes from their quest, perfectly detailed and obviously observed from impossible perspectives. They saw themselves in the Temple of the Final Breath, in the Whispering Desert, even in private moments aboard the Windraiser when they had thought themselves unobserved. "Did you truly believe you could move against me without my knowledge? Every step you have taken, every choice you have made, has served my ultimate purpose. The components you have gathered, the trials you have overcome, all of it has been in service to my design." Lysera's scales flickered with barely controlled rage. "You're lying. The trials were ancient, created long before you ever drew breath." "Ancient, yes," the Shadow King agreed, with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever, "but not unchanging. Did you never wonder why the dragon's breath came so easily into Captain Thorn's hands? Why the desert's trials seemed almost tailored to your specific psychological needs? Why the moon goddess's tear was simply waiting for you to claim it?" The terrible possibility began to dawn on them. The Shadow King hadn't been trying to stop their quest. He had been guiding it, shaping it, ensuring that they would gather exactly the components he needed for his own purposes. "You see, my dear enemies," he continued, rising from his throne with fluid grace, "the dark crown requires more than simple shadow to achieve true perfection. It needs light to define the darkness, hope to give shape to despair, love to make the corruption complete. You have brought me the tools of my own transcendence." He gestured again, and the crown materialized above his head, a thing of terrible beauty crafted from crystallized shadow and bound with threads of pure malevolence. But it was incomplete, missing 3 key elements that would stabilize its chaotic energies and allow its wearer to command not just shadow, but the fundamental forces that govern the relationship between light and dark. "The breath of the first dragon, to give me power over the storms between worlds. The tear of the moon goddess, to let me command the tides of emotion and dream. And..." His eyes fixed on the crystal case Kira wore next to her heart. "The fragments of the crown of eternal light, to provide the perfect counterpoint to my own darkness. Light and shadow in eternal balance, with me as the fulcrum that controls both." The Shadow Knights moved closer, their weapons ready, but they seemed almost casual in their menace, guards who knew their prisoners had no hope of escape. "Surrender the components," the Shadow King commanded, his voice taking on harmonics that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the fear centers of the brain. "Give me what I need to complete my crown, and I will grant you the mercy of a swift transformation into shadow. Resist, and I will ensure that your consciousness remains intact as I convert you into decorative elements for my throne room, aware and suffering for all eternity." But Kira was already moving, her hands reaching not for the components they had gathered, but for the crown fragments she carried next to her heart. As her fingers closed around the crystal case, she felt the ancient magic stirring within, not the full power of the original crown, but something that had been growing stronger throughout their quest, fed by every act of courage and sacrifice they had made. "You made one mistake," she said, her voice carrying a new authority that made the Shadow Knights hesitate. "You assumed we came here to surrender, but we didn't come to give you our components. We came to complete our crown." The case opened with a sound like crystalline bells, and the fragments of the crown of eternal light rose into the air, no longer broken pieces but parts of a greater whole that was finally ready to be unified. The breath of the first dragon flowed from Captain Thorn's hands, golden fire that danced around the fragments like living music. The tear of the moon goddess pulsed in Lysara's grasp, its light growing brighter as it responded to the call of its destined purpose. Impossible, the Shadow King snarled, his perfect composure finally cracking. The binding requires a sacrifice, an Ember Keeper's life force freely given. You cannot forge the crown without paying the price. You're right, Kira said, and she smiled with the fierce joy of someone who had finally understood the true nature of her destiny. But you never understood what that sacrifice really meant. She reached out to her companions, feeling the connections that had been forged between them through shared trials and mutual trust. Lysara's draconic wisdom, Captain Thorn's storm-touched courage, the loyalty and love of the people of Lumenhold who had trusted her with their protection, all of it flowed through the growing crown, each connection adding another thread to the web of light that was taking shape above their heads. The sacrifice isn't death, Kira continued, her voice growing stronger as the crown absorbed more of her life force, not destroying it, but transforming it into something greater. It's the willing choice to connect with others, to let their strength become yours and your strength become theirs. It's love, freely given and freely received. The crown of eternal light blazed to completion above her head, no longer just an artifact, but a living symbol of the bonds between all conscious beings who chose connection over isolation, hope over despair, love over fear, and the Shadow King's dark crown began to crack. "No!" he screamed, but his voice was already losing its hypnotic power. "I am the master of shadow. I am the end of all stories." "You're the opposite of a story," Kira said, settling the completed crown on her brow, with hands that now glowed with inner light. "You're the silence that comes when people stop caring about each other. But as long as anyone chooses to love, to hope, to connect, you'll always be nothing more than an absence waiting to be filled." The crown of eternal light pulsed with the heartbeat of every living thing that had ever chosen to matter, and the Shadow King's realm began to dissolve like a nightmare at the touch of dawn. Epilogue: The Dawn of Connections. 6 months after the Shadow King's defeat, Lumenhold bloomed with a radiance that could be seen from realms away. The crystal spires no longer simply held back the darkness. They sang with harmonies that reached across dimensions, connecting the city to a growing network of worlds that had chosen light over shadow, hope over despair, community over isolation. Kira stood atop the highest spire, the crown of eternal light no longer visible on her brow, but permanently merged with her essence, making her something more than human, but not less, a living bridge between all the forms of consciousness that had ever chosen to reach out to another in love or friendship or simple mutual aid. She could feel every connected realm, every soul that had heard the crown's song and chosen to add their voice to the growing symphony. It was beautiful and overwhelming and absolutely right, like coming home to a place she had never known existed. "Any regrets?" Lysara asked, landing beside her with draconic grace. The Dragon Seer had become something new as well. No longer the last of her kind, but the first of something different. A bridge builder who helped other isolated peoples find their way back to connection and community. "Only that there's so much to explore and so little time to explore it all," Kira replied, watching as another realm's light joined the network. "But I suppose that's what friends are for. Sharing the wonders so that each discovery multiplies instead of diminishes." Captain Thorn's voice crackled through the communication crystals, distorted by the storm winds of whatever dimension he was currently navigating. His golden eyes could now see the magical currents that connected all realities, making him the finest interdimensional pilot who had ever lived. "Speaking of discoveries, I'm looking at something out here that defies every law of physics I know. Want to come investigate?" "Always," Kira said, feeling the crown's power pulse with excitement at the prospect of new wonders to explore, new connections to forge, new friends to make among the infinite tapestry of existence. As they prepared for another adventure, Kira felt the warm presence of everyone who had contributed to their victory. Not just her immediate companions, But the people of Lumenhold who had trusted her, the storm dragons who had tested their courage, even the spirits of the moon goddess, and the first dragon whose gifts had made the crown's restoration possible. The Shadow King had been wrong about one fundamental thing. Stories didn't end with the defeat of darkness. They began there, opening up into infinite possibilities for connection, growth, and discovery. In the distance, another crystal spire began to sing, its light reaching out to touch realms that had never known such radiance. And somewhere among those countless worlds, other heroes were beginning their own quests, their own journeys toward the understanding that the greatest magic of all was the simple choice to care about something beyond yourself. The crown of eternal light pulsed in harmony with Kira's heartbeat, and the song of connection grew stronger, spreading from world to world like ripples in the vast ocean of existence. The greatest adventure was just beginning. The end in the realm of Ethermore, where crystal spires sang songs of connection across infinite worlds. A young emberkeeper named Kira had learned the most important truth of all, that light grows brighter when it's shared, that courage multiplies when it's joined with wisdom and sacrifice, and that even the smallest ember can kindle a flame bright enough to illuminate the darkness between stars. The crown of eternal light had been restored, but more importantly, the bonds between all conscious beings who chose hope over despair had been strengthened beyond any shadow's power to break. And in that network of connection, new legends were being born every day.